Hello, this is Greg Muna, aka Master Moo, and welcome to today's installment of Music is a Revelation, sort of ongoing series of discussions about music, philosophy, and how it relates to perception, our understandings of science, our understandings of music theory, psychoacoustics, and phenomenology, theology, all that good stuff. And what I'm doing is relating my work, which you've seen maybe on YouTube or TikTok or Twitch or what have you, which are the oscilloscope visualizations of compositions of mine, which are created out of sinusoidal patterns, wave patterns, but they're determinate compositions. I'm a trained composer. They're part of larger pieces, which you can find on my YouTube channel, which are described as little symphonies, little 10-part symphonies. 10 parts because each of them have 10 instruments, 10 sounds, 10 specific pitches in 10 specific rhythmic ratios, which are chosen to express a specific type of emotion. And this is my creative process for these pieces, which are very abstract and very out there in terms of like their modernist aesthetic, because the pitches and the rhythms don't correspond to the traditional pitches and rhythms of either classical music or pop music, but which I've chosen to express sort of my personal private emotions, in which some of you may resonate with. So I'm talking about my creative process, but I'm also relating my creative process, which some of you have been asking about, to my musical training and the music that I love, and I think the music that we all love. And that's an opportunity for me to honor the true greats, the great composers of the past. And what all the great composers have done, besides working extremely hard, is that they worked not only extremely hard at being the best instrumentalist they could be, but they worked extremely hard at mastering the traditional disciplines of their craft, and while they were doing that, examining the traditional disciplines of their craft. So they mastered the traditions while examining the traditions, and by carefully examining every element of their traditions, they came up with new, original, personal formulations. So I'm honoring two great, toweringly great composers whose birth anniversaries are this week, and who I'm listening to in honor of their anniversaries. The first, and indisputably the greatest, the Papa Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, was born March 21st of 1685 in the modern calendar. In the old calendar, old style, that was 31st of March. There's a 10-day difference. So we can just say the whole period from March 21st to March 31st, we can say, is the Johann Sebastian Bach birthday zone, and 1685. So that is, what is that? 340 years ago? Yeah. And 16 to 17, 17, 18, 18 to 19, 19 to 2000, no, 440 years ago, pardon my rudimentary math. The other toweringly great composer who also was a master of his craft and who, like Bach, examined every aspect of tradition and thereby renewed it and made something new out of it, is the great and awesome and awe-inspiring Bela Bartok, who was born on this day, March 25th, March of 1881. And so that would be 244 years ago. Yeah. And 1800, no. 144 years ago. All right. And anyway, these are both great, and they're both, but I guess we should look at them in sequence because one builds upon the other. That is to say, Bartok came later and he takes some of the innovations of Bach made to tradition and then added his own interpretations and his own innovations there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Bach and how his work inspires me and how my work connects to his work without in any way suggesting any equivalence. So just in terms of general background, Johann Sebastian Bach, whose dates are March 21st, 1685 to July 28th of 1750, was a German composer and musician of the late Baroque period. The Baroque period in art is generally the 1600s to the mid-1700s, definitely ending by 1750. So with his death, we sort of draw a line and say that's the end of the Baroque, and then after him is the beginning of classical. And if you're a classical music fan, you know and love some of his innumerable great works. He wrote hundreds and hundreds, even more than 1,000 works, but some of the more famous ones would include the Brandenburg concertos, the solo violin and cello suites and sonatas, his famous keyboard works such as the Goldberg Variations and the Well-Tempered Clavier, his organ works because he wrote church music, his great sacred choral music, St. Matthew Passion, the Mass in B minor, and so on and so forth. And we talked a bit about Bach before as in terms of the idea of writing music that's connected, sacred music that's connected to the idea of a sacred calendar, and how that relates to the idea of having a sacralization of time. By sacralization, by meaning something made, given sacred significance. That it's not just another day, another dollar, time passes, this day is just like, but that we view the whole year, spring, summer, winter, fall, our rotation of our planet around the sun and our moon around the earth. We view these as significant events, and we think of all of these things in metaphorically or symbolically as valuable, as significant, as sacred. And the major world religions all relate either to solar or lunar events. And, from ancient times, the whole idea of a year, of course, is the Earth's rotation around the sun, so that's solar. And within that solar calendar, the subdivisions are the month, which originally came from the rotation of the moon around the Earth, the lunar month, and but of course those don't correspond exactly. So the lunar calendar and the solar calendar don't match up exactly every year. It takes a longer, I forget what the longer cycle is. It takes like 37 years for the moon cycles to coordinate up against the solar cycles, and the 4 phases of the moon, that is to say, the full moon, the whole moon, and the 2 half moons, correspond to basically 4 weeks in the month, And these have been sort of humankind's go-to for time telling since prehistoric times. We've looked up in the skies and we've coordinated our sense of existence and survival and the importance of that against the relative positions of where we are on planet Earth in relation to two of our nearest neighbors, our moon and our sun. And certainly the two most visible things in our sky, in addition to the stars and so on. And we were talking about how, as human beings, we are pattern-seeking creatures, that we seek regular patterns, and we have always sought regular patterns in the night sky, among the moon, among the stars, to get our sense of regularity, and that we are attuned to these regular patterns, and that in music we listen for regular patterns of music. So what we listen for in music, what distinguishes music in our ears and in our perception from noise, are regular recurrences. And within the frequency spectrum between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz, those regular repetitions are recognized as stable pitches, that we recognize pitch sequences, and we try to find the most recognizable sort of groups of pitch sequences within the spectrum of hearing. And within those recognizable patterns, again, as a byproduct of evolution, we have a nested series of sort of prioritized sense of recognition, which is that we recognize singularity, we recognize ones, and then almost as easily as we recognize oneness, we recognize two-ness, dupleness. And so as much as we, or virtually as much as we recognize just a single thing existing, oneness, such as ourselves, we recognize two things existing, ourself and other. And in music, that two-ness, that power of two, we perceive as the octave. And this is, according to anthropologists and psychoacousticians, this is a perceptual universal, that all human beings in all cultures have octave recognition. Even people who are otherwise so-called tone-deaf people recognize octaves. Da, da, and that seems to be hardwired into the human brain, and which is, in terms of the perceptual frequency, it is 2 against 1. For example, like 40 hertz against 80 hertz. Da, da. I mean, I wasn't singing that, but that would be for example. And in the lower frequencies, that is the rhythm of 2 against 1, 1 and 2 and, which in our bodies at the lower frequencies, for example, at a normal pace, for example, at 120 beats per minute, is a comfortable walking pace in which we walk we shift our body weight from right to left as we are walking. That two-ness is built into our bodies because we are evolved as creatures that have bilateral symmetry. We have a right side and a left side. So we have a right arm, a right leg, a left arm, a left leg, symmetry around the center, which, like our head, which is, approximately symmetrical. And we take in inputs from our right ear and our left ear into our brain. And the fact that we are constantly coordinating right inputs and left inputs out of ears means that our brains function on a binaural, that's what we call binaural, 2 ears, 2 sound sources system of coordination. And what our brains do is that we coordinate these 2 slightly different types of information in the right ear and the left ear, and we create a composite image in our mind. And this is our inner brain experience of sound. And this is also what I'm working with by using sinusoids with strict stereo separation of right and left. And this is why the experience of listening to my music is very different from listening to it just over speakers, versus listening to it in headphones. And these electronic compositions were meant to be listened to with headphones to get the maximum effect, and as a kind of a help with meditation or perceptual focus. The goal of all of these pieces is to develop greater sonic perceptual attention focus, to be able to extend the longer and longer periods that we can stay focused on listening to sound without any sort of external distractions. So this is why I use very abstract sounds. I use very abstract sounds so that we're not immediately thinking about something else. If it were using a pre-recorded sound, for example, a dog barking, it would make you think of a dog, or a cat meowing, it would make you think of a cat. And that would lead to other change of associations, which might lead to distraction, So by eliminating those pre-recorded, by using simple sinusoids that have no processing, no reverb, where there's just a pure pitch and where there's zero noise in terms of attack and decay, and where there's no distortion, no noise, pure pitch in a very specific, discrete rhythmic unit, that's easier for our brains to absorb. And I also keep a flat dynamic in these pieces so that we're not getting jolted out of our concentration by a sudden shift from very loud to very quiet, so we don't have to constantly adjust our perceptual parameters, so that once you start listening, there's sort of a continuous flow of interrelated pitches and rhythms. And in these pieces, I just used 10 at a time because that was just a number that seemed that like it was enough to create variety, but not too much, so it was overwhelming. So that was sort of an arbitrarily chosen limit that I chose. I felt that by working with 10 frequencies and rhythms at a time, that it was enough to express these basic emotional states which I experience and which I wanted to share with you. And each one is different. As I said, these pieces, if you go onto YouTube, they have a sort of a first movement and an exposition, a second movement, a development, which was often basically following a reverse order of events from the first exposition, the first movement, and then a final summation of the chord of all the 10 elements simultaneously, and then dying away as a kind of a final repetition of the basic material and as a kind of a fade out back to that 0 point. And the whole point of this is not as an abstract exercise. It uses technique, it uses theory, it uses counterpoint, it uses harmony and melody and rhythm, but the purpose is emotional, to express a private state of emotion. And it's always very difficult when you express private emotions in music. I mean, we're trained from a very young age only to express publicly acceptable emotions, whether we're at work or among friends. That's a basic part of making that transition from being a young child to being a functioning adult. And once we're adults, we're very careful because we don't want to bother other people with our private emotions. We want to keep them. So when we do that, we're kind of, there's kind of a taboo sense of sharing. And I understand that. And you may be baffled by the emotions that I'm trying to express in these videos, but what I'm really trying to express are my most private emotions. And let's take, before I go back to talking about Bach and Bartok, I just want to take a moment just to think about that spectrum of like emotions from public to private. And there are, public emotional expression, the emotions which everyone is encouraged to express in public are have to do with group identity. So expressions of patriotism, national anthems, singing along, marching along, public celebrations of public institutions, of patriotism, and of official, dominant religious expressions, whatever is the dominant religious tradition in any society, the music that goes along with that, in a Christian society that would be Christmas music or Easter music and things like that, what we call euphemistically holiday music. Those are the most publicly acceptable emotions that nobody, and then in that sort of next category, moving from the most public to less public, are the sort of socially approved personal emotions related to sort of officially sanctioned relationships. For example, parental emotions, like love, expressing love for your children in the form of lullabies, for example, or children's songs, or, things which express, socially approved relationships, parental, filial, marital, expressions of love and affection between family members, a husband and wife, parents, a child, and so on. Those would be, that's also socially acceptable. That's sort of like keeping pictures of your family members on your desk at work, right? In terms of, but artistic expression of emotion then goes more into the less publicly acceptable emotions, the emotions which generally are only discussed in private or among friends. And this is where art, becomes either more valuable or less valuable to people depending upon their perspective. So often when people listen to music for specifically emotional reasons, the other types of music that we're talking about, like march music, patriotic thing, that's just group activity, and there isn't necessarily a lot of emotion associated with that. But the really emotionally, when people talk about like listening to love songs, sad songs, that's really about their private, love lives, perhaps their unhappy love lives or their illicit love lives, and so on and so forth. And that's why so many of the great, like for example, operas and things like that are so popular, deal with these unhappy and socially unapproved relationships. You can look at at great Italian operas, great German operas, for example, Tristan and Isolde by Richard Wagner. It's 4 hours of expression of all of the heartbreak and misery associated with a secret romance between two people. So that's another category of sort of like more private emotion, and that can veer into really extreme states of heartbreak and grief. Private grief as opposed to public grief. Public grief might be considered like funeral music that would be, or requiem music for mourning in a publicly acceptable, sort of a funeral situation, but as opposed to private grief, which would be more of a private emotion. And the private emotions go all the way into very, very psychologically disturbed states of, extreme agitation and so on and so forth. And that's generally where people who are not artistic fans say that things get too intense for them. Art and music that express these extreme states of emotion, if you're not a big fan, then people will say, oh, that's too much for me, that's too intense, that's too weird. So the extreme emotional states that you might get in the music of Bach, for example, like in the incredible sense of grief and catharsis that you might experience in his Chaconne in D minor from his D minor partita for solo violin, or Bartok in his overwhelmingly emotional string quartets. These might be too emotional or too extreme for just casual listeners who just want music that's just more pleasant and more something to in the background while they're shopping. You would never listen to a Bach violin sonata or a Bartok string quartet while you were shopping or working out or just having a lighthearted meeting with friends. That's something that you would only listen to in a state of by yourself, in a state of extreme concentration, with no screens and no distractions or anything like that. And the greatest masterpieces of the greatest composers are meant for that total focus. And Bach, again, born March 21st, March 31st, Bela Bartok, born March 25th. So this is who we're honoring this week. We're masters of music which is meant for total sonic, perceptual attention, non-dual, non-distracted attention. And even though they wrote at very different times, even though Bach mostly was writing, music which seems perhaps less personal than Bartok's because he wasn't a modernist, he was a Baroque composer, and Bach's music was considered old-fashioned in his time. Even by the time of his son's generation, he was considered to be very old-fashioned. And Bartok lived from 1881 to 1945. His music reflects the modernism of the early 20th century, the modern sensibility of the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. And it can be too much, often people will not react positively to hearing the innovative musics of either Bach or Bartok because of that intensity, because of that, and because of the extraordinary attention that they gave to every detail of their own tradition and their own techniques. Again, before talking specifically about Bach and what Bach means to me, and Bartok and what Bartok means to me, because this conversation will be ongoing, I just wanted to talk about the types of emotions that I'm trying to express in my music and in the oscilloscope videos, which is that I want to express my goal, and whether or not I succeed, I can't be the judge. I'm trying my best, and I hope I succeed, and it's for you to determine whether I succeed. But my goal, in terms of what I'm trying to express what is for me the most private level of emotion, which for me is beyond the intensity of heartbreak or despair or these extremes of musical emotions that you have in romantic or post-romantic or modern music. I'm trying to express for me what is beyond a subjective experience, what is beyond a psychotic break. And a psychotic break is when your sense of subjective self breaks down. And it happens in meditation, it happens in psychedelic assisted therapy, it happens in extreme life situations, and it has happened to me, and it happens to everyone when our conventional sense of self breaks down, whether through trauma or through stress or whatever like that. And what you're left with is simply, at that point, your faculties, your perceptions, your emotions, your rational thoughts, your physical maintenance, which is to say like your breathing, your heartbeat, your survival drives, your sense of basic functioning in terms and your drives, the aggressive, the erotic, the thanatic drives, which are subconscious and unconscious, and but without any coordinating, centralizing sense of subjectivity or self. In that extreme emotional state beyond subjectivity, of non-subjectivity, that is when we can experience sounds and our perceptions without subject and without object, without a source of the sound and without a receiver of the sound. And this is simply how we experience sound inside of ourselves, inside of our own minds, in complete solitude and in meditation. So my goal is to express and to transcribe as faithfully as I possibly can the real sounds that I hear inside of my own mind when I'm in that state of complete absorption. And I'm trying to replicate that and share that with you in the hopes that it is true for you. These sounds are true for me, and it is my heartfelt wish that they will be true for you as well, in a way which is completely beyond sort of the regular public expressions of emotion or private expressions of emotion. These are the secret expressions that we never share, because when we are talking about a non-subjectivity or a breakdown of subjectivity, people instantly think, oh, you're crazy, that's insane, but it's not. We can actually be very sane, but silent and focused, and we can sit and maintain posture and breath and sit in that space in which we are not referring our sense perceptions to self or other, inside or outside, but where sounds simply exist, where listening is happening, where hearing is happening, where perception is happening, and there's no need to separate it into the perceiver and perceived. So I also feel that these composers who we're commemorating today, Bach and Bartok, the two of the great Bs of all time, were great masters of this type of emotional expression, of going completely interior. So how did they do that? And how do I try to, in whatever limited way that I can, with my own limited technique, follow in their footsteps? Well, we'll be talking about that for a long time. But let's take a look at Bach's musical style and how he adapted it to his own vision. And as we said, Bach was a Baroque composer, and he used the basic traditions of Baroque composition, where basso continuo, so that he was a continuo composer, and he used harmony of the chorale harmonizations, and he wrote counterpoint. So continuo, harmony, counterpoint. And the way he used it is endlessly surprising, and he found harmonic possibilities within these, and rhythmic possibilities within these traditions, which no one else ever thought were even possible. And once again, we talked in the before in a previous episode of continuo. What is continuo? In Baroque music, continuo is the background texture of that's used in instrumental and in church music, and it's usually a very simple keyboard and a bass instrument providing a bass line and a steady rhythm, and the chord progressions that the other instruments are playing off against, that are playing melodies against. And this was my basic idea. This is why I call all of these electronic pieces continuo. I'm trying to create a 21st century equivalent to this 16th and 17th century Baroque continuo, which Bach was a master of. A background texture for other music. So again, when you are listening to this music through speakers or through a sound system, the idea is that this is the background texture, and that you should then take out your instrument or your voice, and that you should match these pitches and rhythms with your instrument or your voice, and then find your way through the texture to your own melodies and your own harmonies, keeping these rhythms and these pitches constantly referring to that. So that is the sort of the basic. And basso continuo allows for a degree of improvisation. And this is very important, is that a continuo, such as a basso, meaning bass, and continuo, continuing, is you listen to a bass note and the harmony that emerges from that. All right, so it's rooted in the overtone series. It's rooted in the idea that the bass note, that the other notes are harmonically related to the bass note, which we said is a function of our perceptual recognition of the natural overtone series of any pitch. And I said that my compositions are based upon this idea that there is a fundamental pitch, and that we're listening to relationships of overtones of a pitch. They might be very complex relationships, but there's always a fundamental pitch that they're all related to, even if it is subsonic or below the threshold of hearing, right? And so that's a Baroque technique which Bach was a master of, which I emulate. And of course, another technique which Bach was a master of was 4-part harmony. It predates Bach, and I sometimes use 4-part harmony. These pieces use a 10-part harmony, but with only one pitch at a time. And that was the transition from the medieval modal system to the Baroque modern system of what we call common practice, diatonic, major and minor scales. And by the time they made the transition from the old church modes, which were rather fixed in pitch, to Bach's time, it became possible to have major and minor keys in 12, based upon 12 different fundamental pitches. And so that would, plus major and minor of each one, the result was 24 possible keys when 12 tones per octave. Yeah. So by Bach's time, there was the understanding that there were really 12 pitches, 12 tones per octave, versus the earlier medieval thinking of there only being like basically a maximum of 6 or 7 tones per octave. And so that opened up new possibilities, and Bach fully explored that tonal space in his music. So the well-tempered clavier, his sense of each, that those have 24 parts, 12 basic pitches, and each major and minor, that 12 times 2 equals 24, all in the sort of the basic harmonic system of the Baroque, which we call the common practice system. The common practice system is based upon not only the tonic, the fundamental pitch, but also the dominant, which is the relationship of the fifth, the perfect fifth. And in terms of our continuo here that I use, that's the relationship between 2 and 3 that generates the perfect fifth. So when you hear a perfect fifth in the bass line, the harmonic ratio the higher pitch is 3 against the lower one of 2. 2 against 3 generates the basic structure of Western harmonic music, which is the alternation of the bass 1, 5 back to 1, and that's a symmetrical relationship, 1, 5, 1. And as musical language developed, and some would say evolved, from the period from the Baroque period through the Classical period, there's always that symmetrical structure on different levels, from the lowest bass level to the highest melodic level of 1, 5, 1, going, and then getting from the tonic to the dominant back to the tonic. And when we listen to Bach, Beethoven, Bartok, any of these composers, we're constantly aware of this on every level, this sort of fractal embedding of 1, 5, 1, 1, 5, 1, going from the lowest to the highest levels in every dimension of the music, from the largest to the smallest, from the lowest to the highest. And learning how to hear those embedded levels of 1, 5, 1 of tonic, dominant, tonic, and the descent from the dominant down to the tonic, and the resolution of the higher, the comparative dissonance, the higher beats of 3 back to the 2 down to the 1. This is our sense of cadence. This is our sense of closure that we listen for. This is what gives Western music its sense of beginning, middle, and end, its sense of opening, development, and closure, of starting, of establishing a reference, of a building up of energy, of tension, and the resolution of that energy back to its original state. And this is how we can listen to a whole Bach fugue, or a whole Beethoven sonata, or a whole series of variations, and to keep it unified as one experience in our head that lasts longer, and that's on a bigger scale, on a greater scale of complexity than, say, just a typical, a snippet, 30-second snippet of a song on TikTok, or a 2-minute song that you might hear in the background music at the supermarket or while shopping. And both Bach and Bartok devoted their lives to expanding that basic symmetrical structure of 1, 5, 1, going from the working out the sense of the relationship of 2 against 3, right? And 1 to 2 and 2 to 3, because we said we hear number relationships in that basic sequence of like 1, 2, 3, and then the lowest prime number is 5, and then 7 is pretty much the limit of intuitive. But I try to push beyond that with these pieces, beyond 1, 3, between 1, 3, 5, and 7, or 2, 3, 5, and 7. I try to push beyond that limit, and whether or not that succeeds or not, again, that is your decision. Now, Bach practiced modulation, moving from key to key, and in ways which were unprecedented in his time. No other composer in his generation would move through every key from the 12 major and 12 minor keys without returning in such a completely free way as Bach. And we said that those levels worked on every level. So in terms of Bach, we're talking about the lowest bass notes, and he had organs that had extremely low bass notes, and he even worked with very low instruments like contrabassoons in the St. John Passion, up to extremely high-pitched instruments, the highest notes of the organs and stuff like that. And what you notice in Bach is that as he goes from his lowest pitches to his highest pitches, he adds ornamentation. And that's, so he does versions of the same patterns, but with faster notes and passing notes. And ornamentation is a very important part of Bach's style, and he was a great innovator of the art of ornamentation, which is also improvisatory in nature. I'm very concerned with bringing back improvisational elements. So these continual pieces that you hear, these are determinate background structures for an indeterminate or unscored foreground, which is to be filled in with live instruments and voices matching these pitches and these rhythms in real time. And each realization would be unique and improvisational. Bach wrote for improvising performers, and he was very free with that. Oboe parts, trumpet parts, violinists. He expected all of these players to to follow his guidelines for ornamentation, but then to add their own, using their own sensibilities. The most important basic characteristic, and where Bach is the reigns supreme over all of the composers, is counterpoint. And counterpoint is everything. I will be so bold, and I'll come back to this in future episodes, to say that our entire tradition, the entire tradition of art music, is the tradition of extended counterpoint. The entire tradition of Western or European art music is extended counterpoint. Counterpoint can be very simple, as in folk music, like singing "Row, row, row your boat," like a simple canon. But in the hands of Bach, Beethoven, they all studied how to write one melody against another in a way which is rhythmically, melodically independent. So to have a minimum of two voices against each other. The paradigm of counterpoint is just treble against bass, two voices, and from there it can expand to like an infinite universe of possibilities. And in Bach, the complexity is dizzying. Bach has fugues ranging from, he has canons and inventions in two and three voices. He has fugues that go from 2 and 3 voice texture to 4, 5, and even 6 voice texture. There are Bach wrote fugues in 6 independent parts. They are mind-blowingly complex and difficult, but they're real and they're great and expressive and express unique emotion. And he went back and forth between that complexity of counterpoint and his simple homophonic texture in his 4-voice chorales, the 4-part chorales, which were meant for community singing, for church singing, because Bach's music includes everyone. It includes the untrained person singing in church, just having a sense of shared community, and it includes the most sophisticated players, the music that only he was able to play because he himself was the most technically accomplished organ player in the world at that time. And that's how he was mostly respected in his own case. And the basic principle of counterpoint is melodic and rhythmic independence. And I've worked very hard to establish this idea of rhythmic independence. How can I create maximum independence with a minimum amount of material, only using 10 notes? Far fewer notes than Bach would use, And I don't think there's any piece by Bach that only has, 10 pitches in it. I mean, only 10 pitches with no transpositions, because these pieces only use 10 notes, without any octave duplications. So how do you create a texture which is rhythmically independent and with genuinely contrapuntal with only 10 notes? That's been a challenge for me. And again, whether I've succeeded or not, that's for you to judge. But I'm still working at it, and I will continue working on these problems until the day I die, because they are essential to the type of emotion that I'm trying to express. As I said, of this completely most private level of emotion, of the experience of sound beyond the breakdown of a sense of self. Like, what is sound when there is no more subjectivity? Sound beyond subjectivity. After that psychotic break, after the neurotic outbreak, after the psychotic break, what's beyond there? What is perception? What is sound beyond neurosis, beyond psychosis? What is the sounds that we hear inside of ourselves? This is my quest. I think Bach takes us there in his greatest works. You must spend time, and if you're a composer, you must practice your counterpoint. If you're a listener, you must practice listening to Bach's The Art of Fugue, the Musical Offering, the Goldberg Variations, the solo sonatas and partitas for cello and violin, these great pieces, and the great masterpieces of his choral music, his cantatas and his oratorios. And his cantatas, his oratorios, although they have texts and they're meant for church service, they have, I said, a larger connection to the idea of rhythm because they're connected to the idea of sacred time in terms of the church year, the idea of a sacralized time. So they're dealing with time periods far vaster than the pitch frequencies, of 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. They're dealing with the frequencies of, 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, if you think of that as a frequency, because it is all a frequency, right? And so Bach's contribution is too vast to summarize. I simply want to say that his devotion, his mastery of counterpoint, his obsession with harmony and expanding the resources of harmony, his ideas of continuo, improvisation, and ornamentation are absolutely central to my musical practice, my musical training, and what I want to move forward with in the future. That's Bach. In the few little bit of time I have remaining, I'd like to connect the contribution of Bach to the contribution of Bela Bartok. Bela Bartok, the great Hungarian composer, was born March 25th, 1881, died 26th September 1945. He lived in a very difficult time historically. He was forced to emigrate from Europe to the United States at the outbreak of World War II. He was a great, heroic, dedicated anti-fascist and refused to make any compromises with the authoritarian and Nazi-sympathizing government of Hungary during the war period. And he came to the United States pretty much broke and penniless and sick, and his last years were marked by tremendous struggle. Nevertheless, he continued to write great music until the very day he died. And I can say personally that besides loving his music, I have followed in his footsteps. When he came to America, he wrote his third piano concerto at the Albemarle House in Asheville, North Carolina. And the suite in which he stayed is still there. It's known as the Bartok Room. And I booked that, and my wife, we went there and we stayed there, and we got to get the vibe where Bartok, the little alcove where he composed, and listen to the same birds in the tree outside the window that he heard, that inspired him, that you can hear in his third piano concerto. And I was really beyond happy to commune with the spirit of a great composer and to feel his presence right there in the room with me. It was very great. He's generally considered to be the greatest Hungarian composer, along with Franz Liszt. Bartok studied the same counterpoint as Bach, but took it far beyond its Baroque application or a classical application. He took the basic common practice idea, what we're talking about of tonic, dominant, and tonic, but he expanded that in ways which were inconceivable to Bach or Beethoven or anyone. In his music, you have the same embedded levels of relationships to the fundamental tonic note, but Bartok conceived of the 12 tones per octave as in terms of having an axis of symmetrical axes of it being he conceived of the 12 tones of the octave as a circle of fifths, and which could be traversed from side to side as in the tritone relationship, or divided into equal parts of minor thirds and major thirds, as opposed to the typical fifth relations and fourth relations that dominate most of the music from Bach and Beethoven and so forth. And this enabled him, like Bach, to move through the complete 12-tone per octave world, harmonic world, but in a way which was symmetrical. So with Bartok, you have this idea of pitch symmetry, which is an alternate additional type of tonality in addition to overtone tonality. So when you're listening to Bartok, you are relating your perceptions to a fundamental pitch, but you're also relating your perceptions to an axis of symmetry. And there's always intervallically symmetrical layers playing off of each other in counterpoint. So inversional counterpoint is central to Bartok. And there's always this fantastic interplay, a kind of tension between the tonic harmony and the axis of symmetry. They're both functioning, and your listening is constantly going back and forth between the two. You can listen to his music in terms of 1-5-1 tonal harmony, and then your perception will shift to the axis of symmetry, and you'll hear the intervals in relation to the symmetrical axis in any piece of his, for example, music for strings, percussion, and celesta, or any of his 6 string quartets, or his 3 great piano concertos, or his overwhelmingly great symphonic works like his concerto for orchestra. So Bartok developed Bach's system of harmony and counterpoint and added to it his own concept of axial symmetry. And axial symmetry is what I crucially include in all of my works, especially the ones that have octave duplication. And axial symmetry for me is a principle of form. So in terms of exposition, first movement, and then axial symmetry of a retrograde, there is an axis of forward motion and backward motion. That's one axis, and there's another axis where things all align, and that is that final chord and the fade out. And when there is octave duplication, not in these pieces, but in, for example, when I write for instrumental music for piano or string quartet, there's always, like Bartok, an axis of symmetry that everything moves around, that gives, in addition to the tonic, a separate point of reference that you can focus on, and that creates a variety of perception going back and forth between the tonic reference point and the symmetry of the axial symmetrical axis point. So those are ways in which the great Bach and the great Bartok, whose birthdays we celebrate this week, influence my music, the music that you hear, and manifested in these oscilloscope videos. And I would like to talk more about that in the future. I thank you for hanging in there. I realize this is a little bit heavy on the technical talk, but the point is that it's all about perception. It's all about focusing on perception, developing our perceptual focus through sound, and getting to the point of non-subjectivity, where there is no separation of our experience of hearing, our experience of listening, our experience of sonic focus between listener and listened to, where there is simply sound happening and we are in it. And this is what the great gift that Bach gives us, that Bartok gives us, and why it moves me to tears to even think about how they suffered and how they worked to give this greatness to the world, this greatness that the world can never compensate them for. They worked and gave their blood and they gave their lives so that humankind can hear more deeply, more profoundly, more privately than anyone has ever had before. And I swear to follow in their footsteps. So anyway, please share your comments. I'll respond to them. I'll be checking them, and we'll have more live chats soon. Okay. Love to you all, and okay.